have the greatest job in the world, and that's working with dogs.
Best in Show winner is the French Bulldog.
Winston won the National Dog Show. It was amazing. It was exciting. And to have a dog to be #1 dog in this country, you have to have great nutrition. And I always fed Pro Plan. Just like us, when we eat well, we feel good. And I just love that food and what it's done all these years to all the dogs I've bred and all the dogs I've shown.
Welcome to Pure Dog Talk. I am your host, Laura Reeves, and we had really a lot of interest in our last conversation, so I invited Aimée Llewellyn Zaidi back from the International Partnership for Dogs, and we're going to talk about some really interesting stuff, you guys. We're kind of, I don't know if we're like busting down some barriers here, but we're going to we're going to have some cool conversations. Basically in the when shit happens category, because it does in dog breeding. We know this. Mother Nature is not very nice sometimes. And so Aimée has some really interesting insights based on her work that are going to give us some framework, I think, to talk about some of these things. So welcome, Aimée. I'm really excited to have you come back.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here speaking about this subject area, and it's probably the one that I have the most conversation around, both formally and informally, shall we say. Like, this is also
Right.
kind of the cup of coffee conversations that I often have with dog breeders and other
Right.
kind of dog experts. So happy to share some experiences and just some food for thought that maybe pulls together a little bit of what we talked about in the two previous conversations around genetic diversity and populations, as well as kind of unknown inherited diseases, but also just kind of where we're going with our breeding programs and what we kind of like to think about as a community and within our own kind of individual lines and planning.
Excellent.
Where there's life, there's loss, right? Like, so, unfortunately, that's part of breeding, whether it's dogs or chickens or cows. And so having a little bit of information and equipment in your toolbox of breeding to kind of help you with that, I think is really valuable and really important.
Well, and as I just said as we were coming on air, education is the answer to everything. And we definitely don't know all the answers. I know sometimes we think we do, but then Mother Nature comes down and smacks us upside the head and reminds us that we don't. So let's talk
Exactly.
about it. Let's talk about sort of the concept globally. And you bring such really valuable information and close contacts with what's happening in Europe that is a warning, and heed the warning to pay attention for what we have in potentially our future.
Yeah, so I would love to kick off the conversation talking in a more like breed-wide or population-wide mindset before we dig down a little deeper into more personal breeding plans, because that is what informs our choices and kind of allows our choices within our pool of breeding opportunities. And I have a few examples that I'd love to kick this off of about, that education stream is us making the best decisions we have with the information we have in that moment, and then where that can sometimes kind of those unintended consequences can kind of go wrong. And bear with me, but I'm going to pivot from dogs for just a minute and talk about the dairy cattle industry, because I think that is a great warning potentially to the dog breeding world about what we want to keep in mind when we're making our breeding decisions and how we might want to work kind of collectively to solve some of these problems that we're all facing, and also collectively how we might want to achieve the goals and the positive traits and positive characteristics we have in our breeding stock. So the dairy industry generally has historically had a philosophy of not particularly using a wide number of stud bulls. Their goals when they're breeding dairy cows are not our goals when we're breeding dogs. So they're wanting to produce animals that have a very specific trait and characteristic, but also are not required for longevity. where we, generally speaking, longevity is kind of a priority for dog breeding. So they had two challenges with that, in that if you don't include longevity, or if you are removing those cows at a certain age before their natural lifespan would end, then you don't really know what may be coming into middle or older age, right? My grandparents were in beef cattle, so we ate our mistakes, is the kind of, sounds a bit horrible. Sorry to the vegans out there, but but that's, our priorities were not longevity, because it wasn't necessary. So it
Right.
simply wasn't necessary. So um, there was a study that happened a few years ago, maybe more than a few years ago, 15 years ago now, in 2015, and the researchers looked into, maybe that's 20 years ago, but
10 years.
let's not talk 10 years ago. Let's not do that math. Where
We
the
are
researchers
neither mathematicians, y'all. So just whatevs.
I need a little more coffee this morning. There was a study in 2015, so 10 years ago, where they looked at where the genesis of a modern American dairy cattle came from, and they realized that all of the American dairy cattle at the moment descended from two bulls from the 1880s.
Are you
So we
serious?
talked about, serious. We
Wow.
talked
In
about
all the
that
breeds of all the
in
dairy
all
cattle.
in all of the dairy cattle. It came from two bulls in the 1880s. Those are the bulls lineages that have survived various
Mm.
breeding strategies over the years. So any bull that you find today in the dairy industry will have the identical by descent or ancestor in common that we talked about previously from one of these two bulls. And then when you move from those two bulls, it does not get better. Those lineages were distributed across three bulls, which are Aponley Farm Arlanda Chief, Round Oak Apple Rag Elevation, and Penn State Ivanhoe Star. Dairy cattle are named just as wildly as dogs are named, right?
Okay, so
And
we're talking Jersey, Guernsey, Brown, Swiss.
anything that's a dairy cow in the United States will somewhere in its genealogy go back to these two bulls,
Fascinating.
right?
Hmm.
And so when we talk and worry very understandably about our stud dog problem or worries,
Right.
it kind of puts in perspective
Mm.
like what other industries are doing. And speaking of a stud dog, or in this case a stud cow, from this dairy industry there is a bull named Toy Story. And if you are a livestock nerd, or if you're interested in all in dairy cattle, or you're in the farming industry, you probably have heard of Toy Story. Maybe even you have heard of Toy Story, who sired over 500,000 offspring, and he's within living memory. I think he died in around 2014. 500,000, 500,000 offspring by himself before they lost count, and they
Oh,
estimate that he produced about 2.5 million units of sperm in his lifetime. So,
that's, I mean, like cows only, I mean, cows only have one cow. We're not talking about litters of puppies here. That is an obscene number of cattle.
mhm,
Wow.
mhm. And what's interesting, and hearkening back to our previous conversations again about genetic diversity, funnily enough, in dairy cattle, they started noticing that um, infertility issues were coming into dairy cows.
Mm,
So even though they didn't have to prioritize longevity particularly,
mm,
or they didn't have to prioritize large numbers of calves being born, like they don't have large litter sizes, as you
mm,
say. They have a litter of one,
mm,
maybe two, but pretty
mm,
much one. Um, Having infertility when you're on those small numbers already of production is a problem.
mm,
And the infertility wasn't necessarily, they thought, coming from the sperm, because you can test sperm motility and make sure that the sperm is healthy.
mm.
But what they didn't think about is how inbred, or they didn't really maybe appreciate how inbred those female cows were as well. Because it's essentially Toy Story was mating over and over and over and over and over again with his daughters and granddaughters and nieces and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So the inbreeding was compounding, and they were already inbred to begin with. So on the one hand, the dairy industry is not stupid, and the farmers are not unintelligent, and they have great research. They recognize the value in Toy Story and other bulls like him where, high milk yield or good quality fat content or whatever else those calves were producing. But the strategy of kind of using that one good producer over and over and over and over again was not necessarily the best long-term strategy. And this comes back to conversations about risk and choices. Was it wrong to use Toy Story 500,000 times? I mean, I don't know. I guess that's the choice, right, that you're making. You can make that choice in the knowledge that you are then putting in a risk of perhaps having to start again or from scratch. And then what bull do you use at that point, right? If Toy Story is no longer viable, can you use his brother? Do you use his father? Where do you go from there to have any other option? And in this case, Toy Story seemed in himself to be relatively healthier, at least for the priorities that they had for dairy cattle. So it was really an effect of inbreeding depression that made it less desirable and made them have to reconsider. But what if Toy Story wasn't so healthy? What if there was something in there in his genes that people didn't realize were going to be a problem? And this is where shifting to what we're generally breeding for, which is, I would say most people are breeding for longevity and that health being of a good quality for that lifespan, right? So
Duration,
we,
right?
we don't want dogs living for 25 years that are unhealthy and uncomfortable that whole time, and we would prefer them to not be super healthy but only last a year, right? We're kind of finding somewhere in the middle of reasonable lifespans, and during that lifespan having reasonable health and welfare. So moving into dog examples, when we have breed-wide challenges, I thought it would be interesting to talk about clad in the Irish setter because that's something that I think there are differences country to country how that has been managed. And I just like to talk about what I'm most familiar with, which is the strategy on the British Isles that was kind of in the 1980s when they started noticing clad in the Irish setter, and they were losing puppies. And clad is canine leukocyte adhesion deficiency. So it's like a blood clotting and immune system disease. And it's not impossible for those dogs to live to breeding age and beyond, but generally speaking, they would die as puppies. And it would sometimes be not clear why. So for a while, they were noticing in litters that puppies were like failing to thrive, but they didn't necessarily understand that it was because of this specific disease. And then the pattern started emerging where lines were having failure to thrive. And then they started realizing that something else was kind of going on and that it was a specific disease in the 80s and early 90s, which was this clad condition. So in some ways, this breed was very lucky because their observation about this breed-specific health issue coincided with improvements in genetic technology and identifying risky variants or mutations in breeds and also making it an accessible cost. So they might have had the genetic test or the ability, but if it's like $10,000 or 10,000 pounds, then nobody could realistically access it. And genetic tests were used more by industries like dairy industry or horse racing because there was the money in it. So when the clad test and the research became available at a cost accessible point, the Irish setter clubs within the UK started utilizing that test, and the British Kennel Club, the Royal Kennel Club, I guess they're called now, started introducing registration I think first a recommendation and then a registration requirement that meant that you had to test the parents before they would register the litter for this disease.
Okay.
And there were a lot of like grassroots movements to make the genetic tests really cost effective. And there'd be like swabbing parties, at club meetups and things like that. You know how dog breeders are pretty
Yep.
great at like
Yep.
getting those things going. And of course, the breed club was not resisting this because their puppies were dying, right? So
Yeah.
they also wanted a solution.
Yeah.
So moving forward, 5 or 10 years down the road, particularly after the introduction of the registration requirement, you would struggle, in fact, maybe impossible, to find a kennel club registered Irish setter that has even a carrier status for CLAD because they effectively removed
Yeah.
that genetic mutation from their breeding population. It's a great success story,
Yeah.
right?
Super good.
And they worked on this breed-wide problem in a breed-wide way. So maybe similarly, but could I say in contrast? Am I allowed to talk about the Dalmatian Pointer?
Yes.
So,
Well, and
so
and
the
there's a couple. I think the Dalmatian, is a particular example. There's other. We were talking Basenjis and Fanconi disease,
uh-huh.
and that is more on the example like what you're talking about with the Irish setters, where the club, the breeders,
Mm-hmm.
figured out we're going to go to Africa and we're going to bring in these new dogs and we're going to clear the gene pool, and they worked
Mm-hmm.
with the American Kennel Club and they convinced them to let them
Mm-hmm.
do this. And I mean, now genetic testing is available for Fanconi's disease, but back then it killed dogs all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
So
so
So you've actually mentioned what I think is the true legacy of the Dalmatian Pointer Backcross project is actually I think it was instrumental in opening people's minds to the idea of backcrossing or outcrossing to solve what felt like an unsolvable problem. And many of you probably already know the history, particularly if you're in the breed, and you're probably aware that whilst the initial litter, I think, was in the early 70s. I want to say like 1973,
yeah.
around there.
Mhm.
And it was, a Dalmatian breeder who instigated it. And this
Mhm.
person happened to have, kind of a PhD, and they were very well educated and very interested. And there was critically, at that time, no genetic test for HU, of course. So um, they petitioned to have they worked very hard within their individual breeding plans with maybe a couple of friends to produce to produce litters of Dalmatians that met the breed standard and I think were a reasonable example of the breed or the type, but with this pointer element to remove the HU, the hyperuricosura. I can never say that word.
I can't either, but it's
The,
essentially kidney
the
disease.
urate stones, yeah, in the breed, and but it was not until like 20 or 30 years later
Mhm.
that registration was really accepted and acceptable. And so that to me, in the positive way, is obviously not just maybe benefits to the breed, but that they paved a way towards the idea of registration of outcross breeds being or backcross breeds being a possibility and maybe had some positive change in how people kind of think about this pulling the zip cord, the emergency zip cord in your breed as being another tool.
Well,
What
and I
makes me
think, not to interrupt you, but I do
no,
think
please
it's
do.
important to historically to look at breeds that were decimated during the World Wars, that
Mm-hmm,
they definitely outcrossed
mm-hmm,
Sussex. And,
mm-hmm,
Clumber Spaniels were completely rebuilt from 6 individual animals. Yeah, probably there was a little bit of extra. I mean, these
mm-hmm,
things, Irish Wolfhounds were definitely recreated. So there's a
mm-hmm,
lot of breeds over the course of time that, for whatever reason, had to
mm-hmm,
be, if you will, reconstituted.
mm-hmm.
And I think part of the conversation that, is back and forth between like a me and a you, like in our different conversations, right?
Yeah.
Is we're not doing crossbreeding to make fluffy Merle Frenchies.
No.
Okay,
This is the
so
emergency, pull
right.
the emergency cord.
And I think that's just a really important thing to emphasize. So,
Mhm.
sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I
Yeah.
did want to just bring
No, no, that
that
that is
point.
exactly the interruption I was hoping for, because what I wanted to talk about, those two examples, and those two are somewhat familiar examples to a lot of
Mhm.
breeds, and definitely within those breeds, but they are also kind of the low-hanging fruit, because in both cases, whilst it was an emergency situation, these were either an immediately devastating disease in reference to clad, or a long-term health problem and potentially like a welfare problem in the HU. They happen to also be single gene mutations.
Right.
So that means that they are, in both cases, the inheritance form is, you know, mother and father must have one copy of the variant, and there's an autosomal recessive inheritance, which means breeding away from that, kind of whether you have a test or not, if you can identify those risky dogs in some ways, is not an insurmountable challenge. It's kind of the easiest breeding away from problem. What then becomes more complicated, and this is where I'll mention a couple of things, but I'd like to pivot to kind of plans and success, is
Right.
when you're talking about a breed, whether it's a recreation in the post a war or post a major change that you referenced, or in the cases that are probably a little more in the news or in people's mindsets about breeds where there are complex inherited diseases, or there are conformation extremes that make people more challenged in how they're trying to breed away from those issues, because it isn't a single gene mutation or it isn't a simple inherited disease. It's much more complex. So just to use two very brief examples, the Finnish Kennel Club in June have both launched or have launched for two breeds, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel and the French Bulldog, some very pioneering, I would say, and specialized crossbreeding programs. And in the case of the Cavaliers, it's maybe a little less about conformation and more about some structural and disease challenges in the heart conditions, and then syringomyelia that they're working on. And these are very complex, lots of genes involved, and kind of endemic across the breed. That's very hard to find lower risk. And in a similar way, at least within the population of Finnish French Bulldogs, they were very concerned about finding Frenchies that met the breed standards and also had enough kind of variation in either their genetic makeup or in their conformation to breed to what they consider to be a moderate or a reasonable type. And critically, I think for both of these breeds, no one's not heard of them in the world of health around the world.
Right.
And what I personally think could have been a good motivation, besides the breeders themselves being thoughtful and concerned about this, is that there is awareness in the global conversations around these breeds, whether it's a brachycephalic breed or a Cavalier or other breeds with kind of considered to have breeds specific conditions, is external bodies like literal governments kind of getting involved in breeding or making laws about banning of breeds or banning of breeding practices, or you can't have this breed or whatever it happens to be, because of campaigning on kind of welfare related issues. So getting ahead of an, let's say, an outsider, for lack of better terms, involvement, I think must have been in the back of some of people's minds, because they're aware of what their neighbors are facing, an even harder challenge to address some of these health issues when they aren't having maybe supportive kind of government relations.
Trupanion is revolutionizing medical insurance for pets by providing the best possible experience to our members. And it's not some space-age dream. It's happening now. We pay your veterinarian directly while you're checking out, and we're the only ones who can, which means you have decisions in seconds, and you don't have to wait for reimbursement. So unlike with other providers, you'll keep more money in your pocket. Ask your veterinarian if Trupanion can pay them directly, because there's pet insurance and then there's Trupanion.
There's a couple of points I want to make, and these we talked
Mm,
about this ahead. I love your focus on the Finnish Kennel Club because it was breeder initiated, okay,
mhm, mhm,
versus government initiated. So the breeders see they have an issue, they come up with an idea about how to address it.
mhm.
Um, and it's an actual issue, not a figment of some politician's mind issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So the
so there's an education component that is here, right? So educating the breeders, like the
Mhm,
breeders need to know that these are things, and educating the people who are in elected office or in whatever.
mhm.
And education is the answer to everything. Science, as you said before, is the answer to everything, and making informed
Mhm.
actual decisions with actual information, sorry, details, I think is what we need to focus on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And informed decisions, I think, is really my personal mantra as well. I said previously, and I will repeat it, there are plenty of other researchers and scientists and health experts who will give you very informed opinions and will be quite like, this is right and this is wrong, etc. And I don't really see that as my role per se. My job is trying to provide information so that breeders can make informed decisions. Whatever personal morality or feeling I feel about any type of a breeding practice, I tend to keep to myself because my focus is the dogs and equipping the dog breeders who I have only maybe positive influence, definitely no like regulation over, to make really informed decisions. What I think is special about the Finnish Kennel Club crossbreeding projects, because crossbreeding projects are not particularly unique, they've been done formally or informally many, many times. But what I would encourage maybe people to read up about them or have a little investigation is that I think they are extremely likely to be successful. And I measure success by the breeders being happy with the dogs that are produced because this has come from kennel club and breeders' grassroots motivation to make these changes. And that to me is key, not only in terms of getting enough buy-in, enough breeders interested in developing a health program, any kind of a health program, whether it's crossbreeding or something else. You have to have that buy-in and that uptake of that program in order for there to be enough dogs that benefit from it to actually move the line and the bar on the breed health improvement. And the other thing that these breed clubs did that I think was great is they had a supportive kennel club who
Mm,
could help provide them with actual canine focused geneticists and canine focused veterinarian specialists to help guide those
mhm,
strategies.
mhm,
So there was no expectation that the breed club had to find their own expert necessarily or make something up without any support or just throw an arrow into the dark and hope it would work. They were able to work collaboratively between the
mhm,
breed clubs and the breeders
mhm.
and the support of the kennel club who could help them source some of that specific expertise they needed to be successful.
Which, I really think is such an important point to make, because there's a whole bunch of people around here in the United States breeding some version of a doodle
Hmm.
and assuming that that means that the dog is healthier
Hmm.
without actually using any scientific information.
Hmm.
And breeding breeds that themselves have similar diseases
Hmm.
or the same diseases. And so I think that I'm just, for listeners, is this number 6,827 that I've said? education is the
Yeah.
answer, right?
Yeah.
Just randomly saying crossbred is healthy
Yeah.
isn't the answer.
No, no. And so what is great and what again, maybe I'll provide the link if you're happy
Mm.
for me to so people can find it and read up a little bit. And this is so fresh. This is like June of this
Right,
year.
right, right.
What I again and I think we're so optimistic and about it being successful, having that, breeder buying and breeder driven more
Mm,
than just breeder buying is that by having access to that expert
mm,
advice, they were able to, shortlist the breeds they thought maybe phenotypically or behaviorally would be good, and the geneticists could help them assess like which would be better or worse options kind of genetically, like what
mhm,
are there any, you don't want to introduce a different health problem accidentally or have a different problem.
mhm.
And then, do you have enough numbers of dogs in the breeding program? So you don't want to breed away just to one dog because then you've got what do you have? The stud dog.
That's
The
there
stud dog.
again.
Right.
Mhm,
So how do you measure your population and how do you kind of recruit enough
mhm,
of the other breed or the other line or the other whatever it happens
mhm,
to be successful? We talked a little bit previously about, if you have a show line, maybe a little gentler step would be to
mhm,
use a field line.
mhm,
That's probably easier for a lot of breeds conceptually and just for
mhm,
type, but you still don't want to use just one dog from that field line, right?
mhm,
You're just kicking the can of genetic problems down the road. So I really wanted to highlight the Finnish Kennel
mhm,
Club and the Finnish breed clubs two projects because they are in breeds that are sometimes controversial
mhm,
and they are in breeds that people have a lot of strong feelings and opinions and science on and research
mhm,
on
mhm,
about what some of the challenges are. And I think by focusing on what can make something successful, which to me is breed club and breeder driven so that you
mhm,
have enough humans involved, but kennel club support
mhm,
so that you're accessing the resources or the experts that you need to really make informed decision is how something's going to be a winner in a breed
mhm,
wide problem.
mhm,
So that's we talked about this is like shit happens, and to me these breed wide problems kind of go back to generally populations and genetic diversity and kind of big umbrella issues.
mhm,
But what about when you have problems within your own breeding lines, or maybe you don't have a problem but you have a goal
mhm,
to pivot away from kind of negative health or bad health, then what do you do? Because you're not needing necessarily the entire breed to be collaborating with you. You
mhm,
maybe don't need a geneticist either, but you have a challenge, right?
mhm,
So in your own breeding plans, and I mean it can be you personally, but that could be the royal you or the royal we. Sometimes, if you're a breeder that has been breeding for a little while and you have some experience, you know what you like. You know what type you like, you know what behavior you like. You're aware of the breed's kind of trends and what kind of is successful in the show ring or in the field trials. So you have some sensitivities to what is going to be winning awards, but you also probably have your own personal view on what you like. Do you want something a little longer or a little squatter? Do you want something a little taller or a little shorter? Do you want a coat like this or a coat like that? Or do you like this color or that color, right? We all have our preferences even within the parameters of what is successful. And if you've been breeding for a little while, you've probably seen some trend changes in judging and judging styles anyway. So maybe you don't 100% always adhere to where the breed is kind of moving. So you probably know the stud dogs that you personally maybe own or your friend or co-breeder or that guy you met in Finland, whatever it happens to be. You know where your stud dogs kind of are and you see what progeny is produced and maybe you are a stud dog owner yourself. When something happens that you aren't expecting, and I'm going to use kind of a heart condition as just an example, but it's just an example. I'm not outing anyone or naming any names. Maybe you've used that stud dog. Maybe he's been successful in the show ring. Maybe he's been used a few times, and then suddenly he's 5 or 8 or 10 years old and he's diagnosed with a murmur, right? And now you've had these puppies and you don't have heart problems in your breed, or you don't have heart problems in your line, and maybe you're just a kind of a panicky person. What do? Your favorite stud dog that you've been perfecting all these years has a problem. It could be hearts, it could be GI tract, it could be anything, itchy skin. And it's almost always going to be something that's a little bit late onset, like more than 5 years, because you probably
Well,
wouldn't have used him if there was something
and
early
it's going to be
identified.
something that is definitely not a single autosomal recessive.
Yes, and probably something that's not kind of known or talked about in the breed because you wouldn't probably be looking for it.
Or
These are
even
the
necessarily heritable, going back to our conversation from
yes,
last time. Is
yes.
this a heritable condition? I
Yes.
don't.
So so if you have a stud dog, and I'm going to use stud dogs because that's what tends to be the bigger contributor to a genetic breeding plan. If you have a stud dog or you're using a stud dog or if you've used a stud dog and there is a problem, step number 1 is to not panic. Genuinely,
Yeah.
that's the first kind of step because you will know in yourself that you've made the best decisions in that moment with the information you had up until that point. You now have maybe new information. So then the second step is investigate. And you gave some great examples. Is this something that is heritable? Is this something that isn't in the breed, but maybe actually is in the breed? And if you start asking, you start realizing that you're not the only one that has been observing this challenge. Like clad did not happen overnight, right? Like it kind of it did not exist and then it felt like it suddenly did. But there was some kind of step in between that happened where, oh, my friend's litter, oh yeah, my friend's litter did. Oh, and then there was that one litter, right? So just do a little bit of investigating, get a diagnosis like we talked about for when there isn't a genetic test. Do a little asking around with friendly people to see if this is something that it is heritable or potentially heritable, and then if it's something that is kind of unique to your lines or if there's a potentially a broader breed conversation.
And I
And
think, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
no, please go. No, ask you. That would.
Well, the biggest thing that I'm going to add to this conversation, speaking from the breeder's perspective side of it, and that I think sometimes the science side of it doesn't take into consideration, truthfully, it takes two to tango. So
Mhm.
I can breed X dog to Y bitch and have no problem for 10 generations. And then I can take X dog and breed to A bitch that's a completely different set of genetics. And all of a sudden, all this happy that's been, that wasn't expressed over here suddenly it's like,
Uh-huh.
hello,
Yes,
hi.
yes, and that's a
Two
great
to
example
tango.
of
So it
yeah.
is combination. That's what I need people out there in listener land hear me say. It is not, it's not always the stud dog's fault. Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, it really is the combination of the genetics that matter.
Mhm. It is. And so that's kind of a step down the road. What I'm talking about is when you know your own the stud if you're the stud dog owner that dog has it's that dog that has kind of the concern problem.
Mhm.
So for that individual dog, I would pause, and that was actually a great lead,
Mhm.
pause breeding from that individual until you have that information gathering.
Mhm.
And some of that information gathering will be exactly what you said.
Mhm.
Have there been any worries down the line.
Mhm.
And if it's something that is maybe a condition that isn't readily apparent,
Mhm.
maybe you want to have a couple of his progeny checked for
Mhm.
a heart murmur or whatever the thing happens to be, to see, because those things can be hidden for quite a long
Mhm.
time. So you want to investigate your own dog's health. You don't want to panic. You want to pause breeding to kind of see what is really going on in your breeding programs. If you're in a breed that has an abundance of excellent stud dogs, which is increasingly rare, I recognize,
Incredibly rare.
it is okay to retire a stud dog if you just don't feel like taking a risk and keep a little eye on the progeny. That's okay. You can do that. If you are not in a breed where if every sperm is precious, if you're in a breed where every sperm is precious, you might want to prioritize investigating and taking your time to look into this further to see whether you can eliminate or reduce the risk. And again, assuming it's even a heritable trait in the first place.
Mhm.
So I
Frozen
think when
frozen semen. That's my big add into that conversation. Frozen semen is your friend. You can
yeah, for
have this dog and have it collected and then do your due diligence of
mhm,
watching the progeny that's on the ground grow up, paying attention to how that progeny was bred, right? The two to
mhm,
tango part, and see what worked and what didn't. And if it's
mhm.
all a disaster, fine, then you can flush your frozen semen. But if it's not,
Yeah,
then you know, okay, I can do this, I can't do that. This worked, that didn't. That's that
yeah.
education piece that comes from actual hands-on doing it.
Mhm. And that's another great introduction into both within your own breeding plans
Mhm,
and actually how we will ever be successful in addressing any breed specific challenges or traits. I keep
mhm.
wanting to throw in
Right,
traits because
right,
I
right,
don't, we get
right.
very
100%.
understandably, we focus on poor health, but actually many breeders want to be focused on the
Mhm,
characteristics that are valuable and important.
mhm,
But what you're leading me on to is that the more we're able to think about our individual breeding plans as part of a whole, the term collective action, I
mhm,
think the more successful we will be at meeting our goals and reducing the risks of inherited diseases. Whether you're in a healthy breed that has no breed specific health
mhm,
conditions, but being a dog means you're going to have a health condition, or whether you're in a breed that has maybe a different path that they need to take to get back to where people feel there's a better balance between like health and the traits that they want.
mhm,
Collective action is key, and that's the theme. It's like the collective action on your individual part is, are you communicating with your puppy owners? Are you
mhm,
communicating with the bitch owners? If you have the stud but don't keep the bitches, and who are your breeding friends that
mhm,
you've used your stud dog to? Are you keeping those accurate records? Are you including a friendly vet into your system that can kind of help you with identifying
mhm,
or investigating any of these health issues? But in the bigger sense, are you the Finnish breed clubs who they noticed something breed wide, not just in a few lines, as being a worry,
mhm,
and they are having to work collaboratively, including with the breed club to kind of, or the kennel club to kind of
mhm,
address some of these issues? You will never, I think, have a successful breeding scheme, health scheme,
mhm,
or crossbreeding scheme if you don't have enough participation and enough participation across the breed as a whole, right? So moving away from like crossbreeding and that kind of hot point, like what if you just want to have a simple heart scheme in your breed? What if you want to have a behavioral testing scheme in your breed? Something that's kind of across many, and I pick hearts because so many breeds, so many dogs, I shouldn't say even breeds, so many dogs have something going on with their tickers. So what are you going to do if you want to have a health scheme or a behavioral trait scheme? You still are going to need enough buy-in and enough support in that grassroots movement to kind of push the needle and make those changes. So that's that collective action.
mhm,
And as much as the Finnish population and people have a reputation of being very lovely and pleasant, I'm sure, I'm sure in those breed clubs, there are breeders who are, not the best of friends and maybe don't feel like always being very collaborative. And that's hard. Or maybe, they're Facebook warriors or whatever. But you have to just kind of bite your tongue and overcome it in order to make that change that benefits the breed as a whole.
Right.
So we're not going to panic. We're going to investigate. We're going to maybe pause breeding, and we're going to think about the steps that we need to take to have those collective action solutions. And that's going to include you and your breeding plans and your breeding partners. I know many people have favorite or a few favorites that they like to breed with, and your breed club and your kennel club so that you can access some of that external expertise if something goes wild.
Well, and I think having, like you said, having that veterinarian that you can work with,
Mm-hmm.
is super important. I've been very fortunate over the years, and I really think that paying attention, and Canine Health Information Center and
Mm-hmm.
they've done here with the OFA has been really impactful in terms of moving forward the what I like to call peer pressure group
Mm-hmm.
of getting test and tell, right?
Yeah,
Has been really successful in a lot
I
of
love it. Yeah.
it really has.
And yeah, and one of the downsides maybe of your listenership is I bet they are biased towards people who care and who are interested in improving dog health. And so we might always be somewhat speaking to the converted already, or at least people who are wanting to ask these questions. But
Preaching
I
to the
guess you
choir.
kind of have to, yeah, you have to start somewhere. I love full disclosure. I love sharing information because I also see it as very neutral. Like I don't take it personally
Mm,
if a breeding plan, or
mm,
I don't take it critically if someone else's breeding plan has gone a little bit skew with. Like
mhm.
because I don't really believe that the people that I know would be doing it on purpose or because they're stupid or anything like that. Things just kind of happen, or you have your own bias, or humanly ignore things because we all kind of do that.
I think
And
I
you
would
know,
say honestly, Aimee, that's my big thing.
mhm.
Across the board, the single, if I could pick one thing that across breeds, across organizations, across countries, that I see an area of concern, an area of downfall for dog breeders, is they tend to not be as honest with themselves as
Mhm.
they maybe ought to be. And I
Mhm.
guess I would leave it at that simply because I mean, everybody does what they need to do for themselves, right?
Mhm.
But being
Mhm.
honest with yourself, for the betterment of your breed, never mind honest with everybody else. Let's
Yeah.
just start with honest with yourself. If
Yeah.
if your dog is, ears clamped, eyes spinning counterclockwise, tail, oh, it's just because somebody wore a hat and scared him. I'm like, no, dude, no, it's not. And if I
Yeah.
see 10 dogs over the course of 3 years, all from this family of dogs, all with the same behavior, guess what?
Yeah.
They weren't all scared by a tall guy with a hat.
Yeah. I have had such a wonderful, privileged existence of having conversations with breeders across hundreds of different kinds of breeds and internationally. And the number of times from very smart, very good breeders, very capable people I've heard, oh, watch out for so and so. She's a bit nippy, just like her mother was. Or he has always nibbled on his toes, just like his uncle did, but it's not a breed problem. Or it's not a,
It's not
and
in my
and the
line.
question, it's not in my line. It's not a breeding problem. And maybe, but probably not. Probably there is something kind of going on.
So
And that
that's all I would
yeah,
say is just
yeah,
be honest. Be honest
be
with
honest.
yourself. Even if you can't
Mm.
be honest with the rest of the world, be honest with yourself.
And that honesty leads to solutions as well.
Mhm,
Not only is it better
mhm.
for your own self and your own breeding plan, but sharing that information gives everyone the opportunity to fix a challenge or fix a problem more quickly before it becomes a big problem or a big rampant thing. I would love to get to a point where we are not needing crossbreeding or outcrossing programs necessarily, because we're able to catch some of these challenges earlier, like earlier in the development or the trends of the breed.
But I
So,
think too, just pause for a minute. And we talked about this originally, like in our first conversation.
mhm,
What we didn't know 200 years ago that we know now
yeah.
gives us the ability to find some of these areas that need a little tweaking and tweak them.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
with the understanding that, you know, this one situation is a problem. And I just think that there's a lot of ability to make informed breeding decisions
Hmm.
different way today than there was 100, 200 years ago.
Absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
is a credit to people like yourself that bring us that kind
Well,
of
no,
information.
to people like you, you're having to action the information that we're sharing. I could sit in my little science tower, like many other researchers or vets, and come up with great theories and ideas and experiments, but it's your actions as dog breeders that kind of make these changes. I don't know if this has to be the final note or where we are in our timeline, but I would
We're
just like to,
about at the end.
yeah, I would kind of like to end on kind of in the same way that it's not just the stud dog's fault is one of my favorite things to say, as well as like don't be afraid to ask for help and don't be able to share information, is do keep your health concerns and your breeds in perspective. So if you have a breed where there is a genetic test for a rare disease in your breed, by all means, get a panel test or take a genetic test just so that you know. But rushing in a panic to eliminate a single gene mutation in your breed to the detriment of the behavior, the hips, the coat, or the type is not the solution. And this is where I keep going back to giant don't panic button.
Yes.
Don't panic and react. Just take a step back and think about your personal plans, but your collective action plans. And that's how you will be successful. That's how you'll be successful over a long time. And if you don't do that, and if you feel like being a dairy farmer and just like breed with wild abandon, and then something goes wrong and you feel like starting again, maybe with more than 2 bulls from the 1880s, then I guess that's another choice.
But I think I do need to.
Oh,
I'm really glad you came back to that, because what crossed my mind. Okay, so this is how twisted I am. What crossed my mind is there's only 2 bulls since the 1880s, and it took 150 years for there to be a problem. Whatever. Clearly, it's not
yeah.
that big a
And I
deal.
should, just to
They're
be
not
really
coming
clear,
out with 3 eyeballs. I mean, come on.
well, and to be explicitly clear,
Sorry, that was flippant.
no, no, that's true. There hasn't been just 2 bulls and only 2 bulls and their sons. Other bulls have come in, but every bull has those 2 bulls in them. So that's
I
the tricky thing.
I
And so
just thought it
that
was
is the
really
critical. They
interesting, the
did
Toy
introduce.
Story and all this stuff, and I'm like, that took a really long time to actually make any difference.
Well, and that is an interesting point as well, because that's actually the bias there is we actually don't know, because we know that there weren't any health problems up for the first 1 or 2 years of the cow's life,
Right.
because afterwards they weren't around. They weren't breeding for longevity.
That's just
So I
such a
don't
nice
know.
way to say that.
Maybe at 5 years a leg falls off. We just don't know. Hopefully not.
Oh my God. That's terrible. All right. Well, Aimée, thank you so much. As always,
You're
I
very
really
welcome.
enjoy. It's good to have conversations with thoughtful people that push our boundaries, and hopefully we can push back a little bit sometimes too.
Yeah. I want everyone to be successful. I want to keep these breeds going. Thank
Excellent.
you so much for your time.
Thanks. Thank you for yours, Aimée.
Thank you.